Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar. So we have experts today from Crossref who are going to talk about the metadata research integrity and reproducibility. So this is going to be a first webinar from East German chapter and first webinar that I'm hosting for the East German chapter. Welcome everyone. I'm Manu Jain Goyal. I'm working at the editorial office at the International Journal of Cancer. I see people are still coming in, but I think we can start because So our first speaker today is Dominika from Crossref. She's been a member of research and development team at Crossref since 2018 and is currently the head of strategic initiatives. Her main focus is developing automated matching strategies for discovering various kinds of relationships between metadata records. She has also been involved in a number of projects related to REST API development, assessing metadata completeness and quality, and large-scale data analysis. So we are going to hear from her. And I just want to inform everyone that the webinar is being recorded, and there will be a feedback form once we are finished with the webinar, and the slides will be shared with all the registered candidates. So you will receive an email from Mary in a couple of days. So yeah. Go ahead, Dominika, floor is yours.
Thanks, Manu. Actually, I'll be starting with the first section. So it'll be me
sorry.
and then, no worries, Dominika and then Martin at the last section. So
okay, sorry, because I got this in that sequence. So I thought Dominika going to be the first. So, okay, Madhura is going to speak first, and she's a community engagement manager at Crossref. Her work focuses on engaging with editors, publishers, and editorial organizations to help them leverage rich metadata for asserting the integrity of the scholarly research. So before moving to scholarly publishing industry, 4 years ago, she obtained a PhD in animal behavior, and she's also a board member of the ISMTE. Madhura, please start.
Sure. Thanks, Manu. I'll just start sharing my screen. And I hope that everyone can see it.
Yeah.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Manu, for this warm welcome and for introducing me. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to speak with all of you today. The agenda for today's talk would be as follows. So I'm sure that many in the audience would have already heard of Crossref and what we do. But just as a refresher, I'll start by briefly introducing Crossref, who we are, and what we do at Crossref. I will share a bit about Crossref's vision, as well as introduce you to the concept of integrity of the scholarly record. In the second section, Dominika will speak to us about the concept of Research Nexus, the importance of relationships between metadata components, as well as metadata matching that drives reproducibility. And in the last section, my colleague Martin will talk about how key metadata elements can act as signals of trustworthiness for research outputs, how metadata can support transparency and reproducibility, and how metadata is important for communicating changes. So with this, let's begin with an introduction to Crossref. Crossref is an open foundational scholarly infrastructure. It was incorporated in the year 2000 by a group of 15 society and commercial publishers who wanted to work collaboratively to enable reference linking, which at that time meant assigning DOIs and collecting minimal amount of metadata to enable reference matching. Things have scaled up considerably in the last 24 years. Today, Crossref has a metadata registry of research objects, persistent identifiers, and relationships that's open for all and can be built on by us and others. Today, there are more than 20,000 members from 155 countries. These members create metadata records for a range of research objects, and a partial list is present on this slide. These research objects include things like grants, preprints, journal articles, and so on. They create a digital object identifier or a DOI to tie all of this information together. And this DOI serves as a persistent link, which is always traceable on the internet. These DOIs are resolved, which means that they are clicked on or followed over 1 billion times every month, and the metadata is retrieved by thousands of systems. There are currently over 155 million metadata records, and very importantly, this metadata is made available via open public APIs for anyone to use and build on. So with this data, Crossref powers the underlying metadata behind systems like Scopus, OpenAlex, Web of Science, Dimensions, and many others. All of this is made possible with the help of many partners, including more than 100 sponsoring organizations, which help with technical and financial support for more than half of our members, several ambassadors, and just under 50 staff members who are spread across 11 countries. Our vision is a shared idea of the future environment that we wish to see. We articulate this as a rich and reusable open network of relationships connecting research organizations, people, things, and actions. A scholarly record that the global community can build on forever for the benefit of the society. As to Crossref's part in achieving that vision, our role is to make all kinds of research objects easy to find, cite, link, assess, and reuse. We are a not-for-profit membership organization that exists to make scholarly communications better. We rally the community, tag and share metadata, run an open infrastructure, play with technology, and make tools and services. All of this is to try to help put research in context for everyone in the scholarly community. So what's Crossref's role in preserving the integrity of the scholarly record? Let's first begin by talking about what scholarly record is. So as you've heard already, Crossref members include any organizations that produce research objects. So think of publishers, societies, universities, research institutes, funders, among many others. These members create a DOI for their work, and in this way, they also have a persistent metadata record about this work. So outputs of the research and publishing process create a scholarly record. But a scholarly record is more than just the published outputs. It's also a network of inputs, relationships, and contexts. Now, maintaining this record for the long term and having a layer of context which comes from the metadata associated with the research outputs establishes the integrity of the scholarly record. It also ensures that this record can be used by the whole community to improve scholarly research for generations to come. So by context here, it means that metadata gives us important information about research outputs. It tells us who were the authors of a particular work, who was the work funded by, where were the authors based when this work was carried out. So by giving this important context, metadata provides us important information about any work. So as you can imagine, the richer and more comprehensive Crossref records are, the more context there is for our members and for the whole scholarly research ecosystem. Every initiative and service that we have launched since our founding has been focused on documenting and clarifying the scholarly record in an open, machine actionable, and scalable form. By doing so, we want to make it easier for the research community to assess the trustworthiness of scholarly outputs. It's important to note that Crossref itself does not assess the quality or integrity of the research process, but rather it enables those who produce scholarly outputs to provide metadata about how they ensure the quality of content and how the outputs fit into the scholarly record. So as we are all aware, the landscape of scholarly communication is rapidly changing. Problems of research misconduct and research integrity are not new. Questionable research practices such as fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism affect research integrity and negatively impact the trustworthiness of research work. However, there is a distinction between the integrity of research and integrity of the scholarly record. So when metadata is incorrect, when it's incomplete, or when metadata records are outdated, that affects the integrity of the scholarly record. In recent years, the scope and impact of integrity issues has also considerably changed. We keep hearing about things like replication crisis, citation manipulation, fraudulent peer review practices, paper mills, and so on, which are research integrity problems at scale and they need to be addressed with solutions that are also at scale. This is where metadata has an important role to play. So metadata is basically any data that provides information about other data. So it's not the content of the data, but rather it provides structure and context to existing data. We have all seen examples of metadata. It's all around us and maybe more than we realize. And there are several examples of metadata in everyday life, but today we are going to talk about metadata in relation to research outputs, or what's called as scholarly metadata. Here are some examples of what's meant by scholarly metadata. So when Crossref members register their content with us, they supply us with a wide range of metadata. Some of this is quite basic, such as titles, authors, publication dates, issue numbers, essentially information that describes the content that members are registering. But we also collect certain additional data about these items that are being registered. So this can include reference lists, funding data, ORCID IDs, license data, clinical trial information, abstracts, and data about relationships between items. So information on errata, retractions, updates, they can also be registered through our Crossmark service. Now that I've given you an introduction about Crossref and metadata, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Dominika, who's going to tell us more about how this fits into the Research Nexus.
Thank you, Madhura, for this wonderful talk. I would like to invite now Dominika. Please go ahead. Yes, we can see the slides.
Thank you, Madhura. My name is Dominika Tkaczyk, and I will talk today about this vision of Research Nexus, which is an open network of relationships connecting research outputs, organizations, people, and more. It is a very useful way of looking at the scholarly record that was mentioned by Madhura. Traditionally, we used to look at the scholarly record as a collection of research outputs. These outputs can be journal papers, conference papers, or books, but also preprints, reports, news articles, datasets, or software, pretty much any kind of an output from research activities. And such research outputs will have metadata records containing information such as titles, various dates related to the publishing process, information about authors and their affiliations, funding information, and so on. It is easy to see, though, that modeling the scholarly record as a collection of independent research outputs is not really enough. To show this, let's consider for a moment one of the fundamental concepts in science, citations. Citation data is often attached to the metadata record of a research output, but what is really powerful is that those citations may point to other research outputs, forming citation relationships. We can follow these relationships to understand better what the particular research was based on. This clearly shows that research outputs are not really independent of each other. There are important connections or relationships between them. And citations are not the only interesting relationships within the scholarly record. Research outputs have relationships with funding organizations and grants that supported the research, with researchers and other individuals that contributed to the research, with journals and conferences where the research was published, with datasets and software that were used in the research, and many more. We call this network of entities and relationships the Research Nexus. These relationships in the Research Nexus are really very powerful. They provide important context for any entity within the scholarly record, whether it is a research output, a funder, a research institution, or an author. Thanks to these relationships, we can easily answer questions like how many times a particular article was cited, or which research outputs were supported by a specific funder. Now, if the scholarly record was just a collection of independent research outputs and there was no way to effectively follow these relationships, it would be incredibly challenging to navigate, summarize, and describe research activities, especially considering the scale we are dealing with here. There are two main components in the Research Nexus: entities and relationships. Entities, I already mentioned, research outputs, organizations, people, and so on. Ideally, entities are identified by persistent identifiers like DOI or ORCID ID. And I also mentioned relationships between entities. Those are connections such as sites, authored by, supported by, affiliated with. One of the most important entity types in the Research Nexus is a work, which is essentially a research output. I already talked about those a lot. Their persistent identifier is a DOI. Currently in the Crossref database, we store 159 million works, and you will also find works in multiple other databases. In the Crossref database, we have 30 content types such as journal article, conference paper, book, chapter, dataset, preprint, and more. Those works and their metadata are publicly available in our APIs. Research outputs are deposited with us and curated by our members, who are publishers, but also societies, research institutions, universities, government organizations, libraries, repositories, and other types of organizations. And speaking of organizations, they are also an important entity type in the Research Nexus. Organizations can appear in many different contexts. For example, a researcher may be affiliated with an organization, research may be supported by an organization, content may be archived by an organization. The persistent identifier for an organization is called a ROR ID. It is assigned by the Research Organization Registry, ROR for short. There are currently 107,000 organizations in the ROR database. The records are available through the ROR API. ROR was founded a few years ago, and the first version of the database was built using grid data. Since then, ROR has developed a curation workflow where anyone can submit a request for a new organization or to modify or extend an existing record. And all those requests are manually curated by the ROR team. One special type of an organization is a funder organization. There is a separate registry called the Funder Registry. It contains 43,000 funders, and each of them is identified by a funder ID. This data is currently curated by Elsevier and made available openly by Crossref through our APIs. We already know that many funders are in both the Funder Registry and the ROR Registry. There is in fact a significant overlap between the two registries. So to simplify things, some time ago we decided to deprecate the support for the Funder Registry. This hasn't fully happened yet. We are in the process of gradually switching to using ROR IDs and ROR Registry for funding organizations. Another entity type related to funding are grants. Grants are the newest addition to our database. We currently have 121,000 grants publicly available through our APIs. Grants don't have their own persistent identifier. They are simply identified by DOIs. They are deposited and curated by funders that are also Crossref members. And finally, I want to briefly mention the researcher entity type. In this case, we have ORCID ID as the persistent identifier, and ORCID organization is maintaining the database of 18 million researcher records. This data is curated by the researchers themselves. Now, let's look at some relationships between these entities. A lot of relationships are deposited by Crossref members in the metadata of research outputs. So for example, if a member deposits the DOI for a cited article in the metadata of a research output, we have a citation relationship between these two research outputs. Similarly, the metadata records deposited by members can contain the DOI of a related preprint, indicating the work preprint relationship. We have funding relationships between works and funders given by funder IDs. Contribution relationships are deposited by providing ORCID IDs, and work organization relationships are given using ROR IDs. This slide shows the overall numbers of those relationships in our database, and you can access all this information through our APIs. Naturally, some relationships are missing in the metadata deposited by our members. For example, sometimes instead of the DOI for the cited paper, we get a citation string, just like the one you see on the slide. Note that even though we don't have the DOI here, we have some information that might lead us to the DOI, namely the title of the cited paper, the names of the authors, the name of the journal, and so on. It is possible to develop strategies, automated or semi-automated, for matching such information to entities with DOIs. This process is called metadata matching. In this case, bibliographic reference matching. Some people sometimes call this citation matching as well. And if we applied such a reference matching strategy to our citation string, hopefully we would get this DOI, which is indeed the DOI of the cited paper here. Applying such a reference matching strategy automatically to our entire database can result in enriching the database with a lot of new citation relationships that were never deposited, resulting in a much more complete research nexus. And matching doesn't have to be about citations and DOIs. It can be applied to many different situations. For example, here you can see an affiliation string, which can be fairly easily matched to a ROR ID. Of course, the matching strategy for affiliations would be different than in the case of citations, as here we have different information about the organization. The schema of these two entity types is very different as well. But the principle stays the same. We have some sort of a description of an entity, and we use that description to locate the identifier of an entity. And as a result, we have a new relationship in the research nexus. Now, I'm not going to lie, developing matching strategies is not a trivial task, and it takes a lot of time and effort, especially if we need fully automated strategies able to operate at scale. So is it worth it? Well, the numbers suggest that employing automated matching adds a lot to the research nexus. At Crossref in production, we currently employ automated strategies for reference matching and funder matching. They already resulted, as you can see, in millions of additional relationships. We have also developed new strategies for matching preprints to journal articles and funding information to grants. The results are not integrated with our production systems yet, but we already know we could have hundreds of thousands of new relationships as a result. We are also working on matching strategies for affiliations. In this case, I don't know yet how many new relationships we could have. Overall, as you can see, the numbers suggest that there is still a huge gap between what we get from members and the complete research nexus. And it looks like it is absolutely worth developing automated matching strategies to fill this gap. If you are interested in learning more about metadata matching, which is, by the way, my all-time favorite topic, make sure to check our blog. Along with Adam Buttrick from ROR, we just launched a new blog series on metadata matching. It started with an introductory post, and we will follow with a deep dive into the product features of matching, how we can develop matching strategies, evaluation data sets, and procedures. And we will end by talking about some aspects beyond correctness that are just as important, such as matching speed, resources needed for matching, transparency, and long-term maintenance. So we talked about the research nexus, where the metadata is, how it can be accessed, and how it is registered and curated. I also hinted a little why good quality and complete metadata and relationships are important. I will now hand over to Martyn, who will cover some aspects like research integrity and reproducibility in much more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominika, for this very interesting talk. Now I would like to invite Martyn Rittman. Martyn is a product manager at Crossref with responsibility for areas that broadly relate to impact and creating links between different metadata records, including cited by event data and preprints. He joined Crossref in 2020, having previously worked in open access publishing and as a postdoctoral researcher. So Martyn, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And yeah, I'm just going to talk about a few more topics around metadata and research integrity, and maybe how it works on a more practical level for publishers. So I wanted to start just by showing this diagram, which was developed. It is in a preprint that was published earlier this year, and that's looking at reasons why work gets retracted. And these reasons are divided into four general areas, which are around alterations to do with data methods and results, author integrity issues, flawed research, and what they've called system level issues, kind of legal issues, things to do with the publisher, and so on. And I'm going to come back to this a little bit later. But just a reminder that we're thinking about at Crossref, particularly about integrity of the scholarly record, which is related to general research integrity, and I'll show how it kind of can feed into more general research integrity. But we want to ask questions like, is the metadata accurate? Is it up to date? Is it comprehensive? And of course, who is responsible for maintaining the record and responsible for certain aspects of research integrity? And I want to just go through three things that metadata can support in this area. So one is about providing trust signals, second about supporting transparency and reproducibility, and the third about what happens when things do need updating and they do need changing, how do those changes get communicated? And I'm just going to go through each of these one by one. We're going to start looking at trust signals. And this slide is essentially a list of metadata fields. And I've put links on this slide, and the links I think we'll send out. You'll receive a copy of the slides afterwards. And these links link out to our API with examples of metadata records that have these fields in them. And yeah, you could probably make an argument for any metadata field somehow being related to integrity and integrity of the scholarly record. But I think these here have particular relevance in being able to say, from the publisher point of view, saying, yes, we're a publisher that takes integrity seriously, and we want to communicate as much as we can around research integrity and around integrity of the scholarly record as kind of evidence for the research community. And our members can deposit these kind of metadata. So obviously author identities and affiliations are really important in establishing who is responsible for the research, both on a personal and an organizational level. Similarly for funding metadata, maybe also be related to conflicts of interest. As Dominika mentioned, we use funding identifiers. We're currently looking at implementing raw identifiers in our metadata schema as well. So you will soon be able to register raw identifiers where you can use funder identifiers at the moment. And also, as mentioned earlier, we're getting an increasing number of funder members of Crossref, and an increasing number of grant IDs that can be used to identify exactly what specific grant is funding a piece of research. If you're using open peer review, you can register DOIs for the peer reviews, and that's another piece of evidence around the integrity of the editorial process and so on. I think clinical trial registration probably needs no explanation as to how that's related to integrity. But we've seen a trend for other types of pre-registration as well, and that's something that we may consider in the future, making that more obvious within the metadata. And of course, for completing the Research Nexus, all kinds of other relationships are relevant. And I would just make a plea, if you're depositing these kind of relationships, please use identifiers. And we do occasionally see examples of where someone puts a relationship to something called supplementary file 1, and it's not helpful for basically following the breadcrumbs and being able to track down, for example, a data set that was used to support a piece of research. And then, of course, identifying the metadata stewards as well. That's something that happens automatically when content is registered by a Crossref member. They are identified within the metadata. And we have within our documentation extensive documentation about how to add these to the metadata, what they mean, some of the subtleties around them, and so on. And I think we might be able to put a link in the chat to this documentation, or you can grab it from the slides later. And just to provide one specific example, if you want to add ORCID IDs and if you're depositing with XML, you will already have this contributor section. You will have the names of the authors, and the ORCID is just one extra field to add here. And this on the left-hand side is what's in the deposit XML. On the right-hand side is how it appears in our REST API in JSON format. And you can see it's one extra field in the JSON, which shows the ORCID that was deposited for this member. And yeah, again, we have documentation around this. You can look on our website to see more about contributor roles, how to use ORCIDs, the auto update process, and so on. So maybe looking at the other side of this and supporting transparency and reproducibility. On the kind of the output side, there are people that are very interested in maybe assessing publishers' as an entity, or interested in investigating the integrity of specific pieces of work. And metadata can provide a lot of evidence and a lot of useful information that can be used for those kind of investigations. This is the diagram that I showed at the beginning. I've annotated it with some of the metadata fields that I've just been talking about. And so, for example, if you want to look at author integrity issues, well, if you have an ORCID and if you have a raw identifier, it makes it really easy to find out who's responsible for author issues and things that might be related to that. Similarly, for the system level issues, knowing the funder and, of course, knowing the identity of the publisher involved is really critical and can help you follow up with the right organizations, maybe to work out whether there's been conflicts of interest or miscommunications, or if there's third parties involved, and so on. If you're looking at issues around data, methods, results, and so on, then including data sets is really important. There's already evidence that including data sets in metadata and in the content of research articles means that they are less likely to be retracted. DataCite are very active in this area. They are a DOI registration agency that kind of complements Crossref. They deal mainly with data sets and with repositories, and you can include DataCite DOIs in the metadata. And that's really valuable evidence for research integrity. Of course, clinical trials on a similar note. And if you're looking maybe at flawed research, or where there were errors conducted in the research, you might want to have a look at the peer reviews and see, are there open peer reviews available with this work? What was discussed in those? Were there things that were highlighted? Maybe there's already a response from the authors about potential errors in the metadata. And so I think hopefully you can see that having a lot of metadata in the metadata records helps to provide evidence which is useful for both transparency and for reproducibility. So, we don't live in a perfect world, and sometimes changes need to happen to research after it's been published, and it's really important for transparency that those changes are communicated. And I just want to talk about three aspects related to that. So how to register changes as a member of Crossref, about the Crossmark service, and about the Retraction Watch database that we've recently acquired. So if you want to register a change, if there is something which significantly affects the interpretation of a piece of research, or even if it's retracted, then we recommend that you publish a public retraction notice or correction notice, or notice whatever the kind of update it is, and that you assign that notice a DOI, and that can be linked back to the original article that it's updating. Now, we know from talking to our members and talking to the community that there are a range of ways within publishers that this kind of process happens. But ultimately, you should be looking to having this public statement about the correction, and then that's something that can be have a DOI registered and linked back to the thing that's been updated, and that makes it easier for us to communicate outwards. Again, if you're using XML to deposit your metadata, to register your metadata, then that you can use this Crossmark section of the metadata schema and updates, and then you see here the type of update, in this case a retraction, and the DOI of the work that's been retracted, and we have a full XML example file available from our website. I think a couple of things to say about this. Firstly, you'll see Crossmark here. If you're not using Crossmark fully and you haven't signed up to everything around Crossmark, you can still do this. You can still register retractions, corrections, erratum, corrigendum, and so on, without having to fully sign up for Crossmark, and we encourage you to do so. And also, even if you are depositing with XML, you may find it easier to register these kind of updates with our graphical user interface, with our web deposit form, and there's a link here, because we know that the processes are often kind of outside the normal publishing process, and so it can be difficult to incorporate and update into the normal publication process. And so on the web deposit form, there's this button, add crossmark metadata, and you can fill in again the type of update that you have, in this case a retraction, and the DOI of the thing being updated. So a little more about crossmark, and probably the key thing that people associate with crossmark is being able to add a button either to both your website and to the PDF of the published content that can be clicked by readers, and that informs them, is this the most recent current version of this, or it may be that it says here there's a correction associated with this article, or that it's been retracted. And it's a really easy way to communicate that. And you'll also see within the dialogue for crossmark some of the trust signals around research integrity that can be these can be customized to some degree by the member that deposits the metadata. Now we know that update of crossmark has not been particularly high among members, and since the beginning of the year we've been conducting a consultation with our community to see maybe how we can modify it or make it easy to implement, or make some changes that will perhaps make it clearer when an update has been made. And we're just writing that up at the moment. So within the next few weeks, we'll have some conclusions about that and next steps for how we can hopefully make crossmark even better. That's the aim. And finally, just to cover Retraction Watch. So Retraction Watch is a blog set up by journalists who were interested in retractions, but they also started collecting a database of retractions, and they have around 3 times the number of retractions that we have. And this was quite attractive to us as a resource, and it was a closed database. At the end of last year, we acquired the database and have made it publicly available because we think it's a useful resource for the community. And it's available via at the moment via a CSV download. It's updated on a daily basis, and we will be incorporating this further into our APIs and crossmark and other services. You might ask why there's so many more retractions in the Retraction Watch database, and it's simply because our members are not registering these with us as updates, and we'd love to encourage more members to do that. So just a conclusion, basically send us all your metadata. We love metadata. We are nothing without our community. We're a membership organization, and we're supported by by our members and their metadata. I know it's not quite that simple. So what I would encourage you to do is, perhaps you are sending us all of this metadata already. But if you, that's fantastic if you are. But if you're not, maybe look at it and think, well, what's the one piece of metadata that would have the most impact on me as a publisher, on the perception of me as a publisher as well. And I think there's a strong, almost like a strong business case to deposit good metadata that supports reproducibility and transparency, because it improves your reputation as a publisher, and it appears in the myriad downstream services that use Crossref metadata. And yeah, just ask yourself the question, what's maybe the one piece of metadata that I could start to include that will help in this area and help in terms of integrity of the scholarly record. And I think I will stop there, and we can have some time for discussion and questions.
Thank you, Martin, for a very interesting talk. Now we have a room for questions and for the discussion. So Eva has a question. Can you identify and exclude predatory journal articles? Some predatory journals claim they have DOIs and even ISSN. So who wants to? Yeah, Martin, go ahead.
Eva, to add anything, or I can answer the question?
Martin, no. I think, yeah.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. Okay, so Yeah, I mean, this is a question that we hear quite a lot, and it's difficult to define exactly, what is a predatory journal, what's a predatory article, and who should determine that. The approach that we take is that we want to be inclusive. We want to support journals that maybe don't have extensive resources, and what we want to do is show these trust signals, collect the metadata and make that available so that the community has the tools to assess, maybe this is a publisher that needs some more support and that needs to have a little bit of education about how scholarly publishing works, or maybe this is genuinely a predatory publisher. We will work with organizations and with reports around scholarly publishers and around predatory publishers, or publishers who are not acting in a correct way. But our typical approach is to work with those members to improve the metadata and to give them the chance to feedback on that if possible.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
So I have questions to ask. Dominika, you showed with this relationships and research nexus. So I was wondering, can we as a journal editor or like as a publisher, can you find the information on the authors who have published with the changed affiliations and different affiliations they are publishing, like different articles? But sometimes we want to know, for us, we have the ORCID ID is important when the authors are submitting, but still sometimes it's difficult to find out the background where they had were affiliated from which institute, and they have different publications. So just to have an information, especially when you want to find out if this is a paper mill paper, or just to figure out to have if what they have published in past.
Yes, I think this is a great example, right, of how metadata can help us assess some of those difficult situations that we are talking about here. It all starts with identifying those important entities, in this case, a researcher, or maybe a group of researchers, right? Like if we can identify them using some sort of a persistent identifier, in this case, an ORCID ID, we could explore that. We could potentially connect. We could use the researcher record from ORCID to connect to learn about their affiliations. We could use their ORCID ID to learn about which other researchers they often collaborated with, which papers they authored in which journals, how often, which other authors they cited, right? And you can start exploring this network of entities to understand more about their behavior. It is typically not enough to decide whether some of the practices were intentional, and how shady it really is. But it's a start, right? It all starts with being able to identify all those different entities without any doubt. If you imagine that we don't have any ORCID IDs, we just have the names. Again, we are in a little bit of trouble, because even if we have names, a lot of names people will have the same name quite often. People sometimes will change names over the course of their career. All those situations, they make it difficult to make sure whether different authors mentioned in different research outputs are in fact the same person or not. So yeah, once again, I think it shows the power of being able to identify entities and to be able to follow the relationships between them.
But quite often we notice that authors have different ORCID IDs, but in that case, it's difficult, right? Then when one author does not have one persistent ID, then in that case, it's really difficult to find them and then to see if this was author, this was the person that who published or who's affiliated and published such articles.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of defeats the purpose of a persistent identifier. It should be an identifier, like you should have just one, one entity, one thing. It should have just one persistent identifier. We deal with it not only with people. We see the so-called duplicates in our database of research outputs, which meaning that pretty much the same research output has multiple identifiers, and it's absolutely it is a problem. I don't really have a solution to this, but yeah, it makes it so much more difficult to follow all those connections.
Right. Anyone? We have a question from Constantina to Madhura. Constantina, you mentioned grant, or I think I did not get your full question, Constantina. I think you have access. Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
So the question is from me, Deepti, sorry. It's to Madhura, basically. You mentioned that grant organizations are also part of the your member list, right? But I'm very new to the subject, so aren't grants supposed to be private? Like, how would you match it? Do you only match it when the grant is declared? Like, could you just enlighten me on the grant organizations being members and how they contribute to your Crossref system?
Sure, thanks for the question. So several funders are members of Crossref, and as part of metadata, one can deposit the grant number and the agency that has provided that grant. So if that information is included as part of the research output, then you can tie the research outputs with the funding agency. So it's helpful to assess what work was funded by which agency, what was the research output that was funded by a specific grant, because at times one grant can be used to fund multiple works. So it's also in that case useful to see the impact of that grant and of that fund. So in that sense, many funding agencies are members of Crossref, and we collect metadata that's to do with the grant and the grant number and the grant that's been awarded. Martyn or Dominika, do you want to add something more to that?
No, I think it's. I mean, I think there are cases where maybe the content of the grant proposal is not public, but I think the grant funder number is public, and that's really useful metadata that the funders actually want to share, and they want that to be associated with the research. It makes it significantly easier for them to track what the impact of the research that they funded is when they can see the research outputs associated with it.
We have in a chat box another question from Priyanka Jain. What sources can be more reliable in cases where authors just create an ORCID ID for fulfilling the journal's criteria? For example, a lot of authors from China do not really have Google Scholar, etc. Yeah. Who wants to go to answer?
Should I have I can have a first go if you want to add anything, Madhura or Dominika. So I think one of the benefits of ORCID is that it is a global system. Researchers in China, I think, can particularly benefit from having an ORCID, and I think I don't think there's an issue with an author just creating an ORCID to deposit to submit a work to the journal. As long as they're not creating a new ORCID every single time. If even if the ORCID record is relatively sparse, that's information which is being fed into the global system of scholarly research, and I think that's valuable for making research visible on a global level. There are a number of countries which have their own identifiers for authors or institutions, and these can be tied into ORCID as well. I think that then it's not one or the other. I think there's space for having having both of those systems. But I think to tie in with the kind of global scholarly communication infrastructure, I think having ORCIDs is valuable.
Priyanka, do you want to ask anything else, or your type of answer to your question? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a small follow-up on this. Thank you for the response. Is there a source where I can look into the different identifier sources that different countries use often, like just a list so that we have in hand? Because a lot of times from my recent experience that I'm seeing that ORCID ID information for a lot of authors is not publicly available. Either they block it or it's from the ORCID center, but it just ends up like for a person whose job it is to identify the author, it just takes a lot of time and different sources that we have to look into. So having such a database would really help in fastening this process.
Yeah, I sympathize with that, having been a journal editor, and I don't know of something that ties into the other national resources. I don't know if anyone else has information around that. I'm not. Yeah, ORCID will probably be the best people to ask about that. Sorry.
Thank you, though.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
I want to ask another question. Does anyone from the audience want to ask question, or can I go ahead as we have left only very little time here? Okay, then I'll go ahead. Okay, so Martyn, you had showed in your one of the slides that the DOIs can be updated, and also Madhura mentioned in the beginning that if there are corrections, retractions, or expression of concern, sometimes you see that they are not linked with the original article, and this can be done by the publishers or journals itself, or we need to first contact our Crossref, or it has to be done by PubMed, or how? Sorry, how would it work then to link?
Yeah, it can be done by the journals themselves. So whoever registered the original content that's being updated, they can also register the updates. And I think it's that there's a kind of a myth that once something has been published and once the metadata has been sent to Crossref, it's set in stone and that it should never be changed and it can't ever be changed. But there are a whole range of circumstances where it's appropriate or even advisable and recommended and best practice to update the metadata record and to inform the community about those changes. And we would love to get a lot more updates being registered by our members.
Yeah, okay, good to know. Thank you. Any plans for the Crossref to collaborate with PubPeer and include in the metadata, or having because sometimes it's you find that okay, this so many articles on PubPeer, but then it's sometimes difficult. But if Crossref has this data when citing or for the references, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's something we haven't looked at. So one of the things that I look after is event data, which is looking for mentions of DOIs around the internet, and it's something that could be incorporated into that. It's an idea that we've had, but we haven't had a lot of requests for that at the moment. It has come up occasionally, but it hasn't got to the top of our to-do list yet. There's a lot of other things that we have to get to, but yeah, it's certainly an interesting idea.
So, anyone, let me check if there are more questions. Okay, so on that note, I would like to thank our speakers and all audiences registered today for first East German chapter webinar. And yes, so I hope you enjoyed the webinar today, and I'm sure everybody got interesting information from the Crossref on the metadata and the scholarly publishing records and research integrity data. Yeah, so I would like to thank you all for joining today. Yeah, so thank you, everyone. And we will send you the slides and all. I hope you got the links also in the chat box. And you will receive also email from Mary in next couple of days with the recording and with the slides. Okay, bye. Thank you.